In this fall season, we've been exploring what it means to thrive. We're discovering how our faith allows God's abundant life to flow into us and through us. Like trees planted by streams of water, our roots go down deep into God's love and peace so that even when the world around us is barren and dead, we can still bear fruit. That's what it means to thrive. Something else we've also touched on over these past couple of weeks is all the different ways the world tries to convince us that abundant life can be found in things other than God. Pleasure, power, fame, beauty, the list goes on and on. But of all the counterfeits to real abundance, there is one that seems to stand above all the others. Even when we know logically that money can't buy happiness, still we're not really convinced, not entirely convinced. David Lee Roth once said, "Money can't buy happiness, but it can buy you a yacht big enough to pull up alongside it." And I'm not sure that's wrong entirely. Some of you may remember reading about a study, came out a couple of years ago, that suggested that there is kind of a perfect range of income in the United States in order to kind of thrive. It's kind of like this is the sweet spot for happiness and life satisfaction. And the amount at that time was right about $75,000 a year, which isn't enough to live in the lap of luxury, but it's enough to meet pretty much all your basic needs and not have to worry too much. And that reminded me of something one of my adult kids said to me once, and I'll never forget this. They said, "I just want to make enough money so that when I go to fill up my gas tank, I can just stare into the distance and wait till it shuts off by itself. Here's my goal." Being poor and not having enough to meet basic needs is hard. And when you're trying to raise a family on a limited income and you're always behind, just surviving can feel like a victory. This week I went back and I Googled that study on income and life satisfaction, and now they're saying that number is probably closer to $100,000 a year. So it's no wonder many of us are convinced that more money is the answer to just about everything. And I get it, because that's my nature too. I've always been the kind of person who, if somebody says one of something is great, well then it should be better if you had 2 or 4 or 10, right? That's me to a T. My brothers always said David can take even a good thing and ruin it. And it's absolutely true. I learned something about myself a long time ago, and I have to be careful, because I learned that I have a capricious, fickle, and unfaithful heart. I do. There's a part of me, for instance, that's just sure that more money or more gadgets or more whatever I happen to be obsessed with at any given time, that's what I need to survive. And the more of whatever that is, the better. I'm kind of embarrassed to tell this story, but a couple of years ago, I bought a lottery ticket when the jackpot was really big. You know how people do. They go out, maybe never ever buy one any other time, but I did. And so there were a couple of days yet before the drawing, and I kept thinking about what I was going to do with all that money. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was obsessed. I was researching, the best strategies. Do you sign it? Do you not sign it? I'm looking into attorneys and financial managers. Long story short, I hated what that lottery ticket did to me just in those couple of days. What I learned and what I continue to learn about myself is that if my capricious heart isn't pointed always at God and God's kingdom, that I can get lost really, really quick. So easy. So the world tells us that thriving and wealth almost always go together, and there's lots and lots of reasons to believe that. But Luke's gospel tells another story. That's what we're going to be doing today. Today we're going to read a story, as Janelle suggested, about a rich tax collector who realized that there was more to happiness and thriving than riches. But interestingly enough, in the chapter just before the story that we're going to read, Luke tells another story about a rich young man who approached Jesus with a question. And the question was, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Remember that story? Basically, this rich young man was asking the same question that we're asking right now. What must I do to have abundant life? What must I do to really thrive? Jesus said to him, okay, since you asked, here it goes. You need to sell everything you own, give your money to the poor, then you'll have treasure in heaven, and then come follow me. In other words, you need to let go of the one thing you think is bringing you abundant life and turn your capricious heart in my direction. Now, the end of that story, as we all know, is the sad one. Luke tells us that the rich young man went away grieving because he couldn't do it. He, as Luke tells us, he was rich, and all of that money might not have been able to buy him happiness, but at least it allowed him to pull up alongside it, right? And he couldn't let that go. Now, what I love about our scripture reading for today is that Luke turns right around in the next chapter, at the beginning of the next chapter, and tells another story about somebody who had great wealth. In this case, however, the young man, or the man in question, wasn't a young rich man who'd followed the law all his life and was respected in the community, because that's what the other story was about, right? Somebody that everybody admired, everybody loved, followed the law all his life. He was as good as you can get. In this case, the man was a tax collector. And not just any tax collector, he was the chief tax collector. And he was rich. When we read the story of Zacchaeus in the context, right after the other one in the previous chapter, it's almost as if Luke is asking us to compare and contrast. He's saying, here are two examples, people that were called, right? One and then the next. The rich young man in the previous chapter seems to have bought into this idea that money is the source of abundant life, while Zacchaeus, the tax collector, is actively looking for something more. And he's ready to trade in his riches when he finally finds it in Jesus. That's the story. So let's take a look at it. It's found in Luke 19, beginning at verse 1. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he has gone to be with the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to your house, because he too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. As I've been thinking about Zacchaeus this week, I couldn't help but think about one of Jesus' disciples who was also a tax collector, and that would be Matthew. On Wednesday night, our Koinonia Fellowship group has been watching The Chosen together. Maybe some of you have seen it as well. And Matthew is a major character in these first couple of episodes. Watching The Chosen has given us a pretty good idea of what it was like to be a tax collector, to be a Jewish tax collector in ancient Israel. As we've seen, this character Matthew enjoyed a pretty high standard of living, right? He was rich compared to everyone else in Capernaum. But the downside of that is that he was hated by pretty much everyone else in Capernaum for the same reason. In fact, in the first episode, we see how Matthew would get to work at the booth where he collected taxes. He actually hired somebody to hide him in a horse cart so that he didn't have to walk, because if he walked through town, people would spit on him and call him names, right? He was considered a traitor to his own people. One of the things I love about this show, The Chosen, is that all the characters we meet that are soon to be Jesus' closest friends and followers were in trouble in some way or another, right? Simon, who became Peter, and his brother Andrew are struggling financially and morally. They've got issues. Matthew was considered a traitor to his own people, had been disowned by his father. Mary Magdalene was possessed by 7 demons and had been written off as irredeemable, beyond help. As somebody said the other night in our small group, the fact that Jesus was able to save Mary at all says a lot, because if Jesus can help Mary move from barely surviving to thriving, that means that he can do the same for us. And what's interesting to me about Zacchaeus' story is that no one really wanted to see Zacchaeus thrive. They didn't care. Like Matthew before him, Zacchaeus was despised by pretty much everyone. And I'm guessing that would include the disciples that were following Jesus at the time. After all, he wasn't just a tax collector. Luke points this out. He was a chief tax collector. He was in charge of other tax collectors. When Jesus saw Zacchaeus up in the tree looking for him, and then invited himself over for dinner, Luke points out that all who saw it began to grumble. All who saw it. Now, I'd like to think that I would have had the courage, like Jesus did, to befriend someone like Zacchaeus, despite what it might do to my reputation. But as someone who's survived in pastoral ministry now for about 40 years, the truth is, I would have probably passed by. Why take the chance, right? Why associate with someone as shady as Zacchaeus when it would just be easier just not to do that? Unfortunately for Zacchaeus and for us, Jesus wasn't much of a politician. He didn't care what the polls said about befriending a rich tax collector. When Jesus saw someone eagerly seeking him, he was more than willing to reach out. As one preacher put it, I love this quote. Here's the good news. Jesus is drawn to shame. Shame and sadness are the pheromones that attract the amazing grace of Jesus. In a culture that was based on honor and shame, Jesus consistently zeroed in on the people defined as shameful by that culture. The outcast, the possessed, the sick, the non-attached, and he reconnected them to community. You might even say that on that day in Jericho, while Jesus lost ground in terms of his reputation and popularity, Zacchaeus gained ground. Right? His stock went up. Now, we don't know a whole lot about what happened that day at Zacchaeus' house, but I think it's safe to say that Zacchaeus' life was never the same again. For one thing, Zacchaeus made it clear that he was willing to make reparations for any harm that he'd ever caused. Right? He said he'd not only give half his money to the poor, which is a whole lot more than the rich young man was willing to do in the previous chapter, but that he'd also pay back anyone that he'd defrauded 4 times the original amount. So obviously money wasn't an object, nor was it ever going to be an obstacle for him again. Jesus said to Zacchaeus at that moment, "Today salvation has come to this house." And the good news is that Jesus can do the same thing for us. Just as Jesus wasn't afraid of Mary's demons, and he wasn't afraid of Zacchaeus' awful reputation, Jesus isn't going to be put off by us. He's not going to be put off by our messy lives. When we turn our capricious, fickle, and unfaithful hearts towards Jesus, it doesn't matter what kind of a mess we've made in the past, or how much ground Jesus might lose by associating with us. He will call us by name and invite us over for dinner. Invite himself over for dinner. Jesus saw potential in Zacchaeus. He saw someone who was ready to turn his life and his heart in a new direction. And tradition has it that even though Zacchaeus was a wee little man, like the song that the kids sing, there were big things in his future. This is probably something you've never heard before. Clement of Alexandria was an early church leader, first, second century, and he suggested that when the 11 disciples came together after Judas' death, right at the beginning of the book of Acts, and they selected somebody to take his place. They needed a 12th apostle. They picked somebody named Matthias, right? And what Clement of Alexandria believed was that the other 11, that he wasn't a stranger to them, that they'd known him for a long time because Matthias was actually Zacchaeus' new name. Just like Simon became Peter and Saul became Paul, Zacchaeus became Matthias. It occurred to me this week that I've got some things in common with Zacchaeus. As a young man, I didn't always have the best reputation in the community where I lived. And you could check that, but I wouldn't advise it. As a young man, I didn't take anything seriously. I just wanted to have fun. I was the life of the party. But fortunately, there were people who saw potential in me and didn't give up on me. At home, in my family, at school, church. Recently, I've been thinking about my 2 years. I was at Iowa State University for 2 years, and during that time, I was partying pretty much every day. I was barely getting by. I was failing my classes. But here's the thing. There was a part of me like Zacchaeus that was still looking for more. Kind of like Zacchaeus up in that tree. I knew that what I was doing wasn't bringing me abundant life. It wasn't working. So when Jesus stopped and invited me to follow, I answered. I was ready, even though a lot of my friends at the time didn't get it. On the day I accepted Jesus' call to ministry, I gained ground, and Jesus lost ground. But in the long run, I believe that calling people like me and Zacchaeus to ministry winds up being a net positive for the kingdom. Because if Jesus can turn someone like Zacchaeus into an apostle and turn a greenhorn like me into a pastor, think what he can do with you. There's a song we sometimes sing, and we're going to sing here in just a minute, in the service that describes Jesus' mission so beautifully. It's called Graves into Gardens. And in one of the opening verses we sing, "I'm not afraid to show you my weakness, my failures and flaws. Lord, you've seen them all, and you still call me friend." Again, while Jesus has every reason to avoid us, to walk right on by, he doesn't. He doesn't leave us alone because he sees our potential. And the song continues in praise of the one who transforms our failures, our flaws into something beautiful. We're going to sing. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. God did it for Mary Magdalene, for Matthew, and Zacchaeus and me. The good news is that that same invitation to abundant life is extended to all who are willing to turn their capricious hearts in the direction of the only one who can. Amen.